August 29, 2005 brought to the New Orleans area the greatest devastation in its history when Hurricane Katrina swept past the Crescent City. The damage came quick, but the rebuilding of the area will continue on for many, many years. During such a disaster, when all else seems lost, one's community of faith can help to ease the pain. Unfortunately, some of the community's houses of worship were damaged, but Munholland United Methodist Church on historic Metairie Road was for the most part spared. But the lives of the members were forever changed, as some lost all they ever knew, or cried with friends who had. Much was lost in terms of membership and financial support due to the destruction, and though things will never be exactly the same, Munholland will rise above, for this once little church has overcome much during the last 70 years. The beginning of Munholland United Methodist Church starts in 1936, when a survey was commissioned by the presiding elder of the Methodist Church in the New Orleans district, Dr. Elmer C. Gunn, to see if there was enough interest in organizing a Methodist church in Metairie. The initial report was unfavorable. The matter would have been dropped, but a small group of determined Methodists, led by Mrs. Susie May Munholland, persisted. Because of this fervent lobbying, Dr. Gunn appointed Reverend Jolly B. Harper of St. Mark's Church to devote part of his time to Metairie. Organizational meetings were held at Metairie High School, which still exists down the road from Munholland as Haynes Middle School. The first two meetings were not very successful, but the third meeting drew a crowd of 33 people. On that day, October 22, 1936, the Metairie Methodist Church was founded.
Well, we were invited to come with a group that was getting up the church, and so I was there when the church was formed. And this was a very important year for me. I was a bride, and so my husband and I were delighted that we had moved in a new place to Metairie, and then we were going to have a church out there too. That seemed just wonderful.
Amongst this small congregation was Susie May Munholland, a most genteel and generous Southern lady. She was born Susie May on May 21, 1867, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Her family moved to Lake Charles, Louisiana, while she was still an infant, and then soon after moved to New Orleans. There they joined the Methodist Church because of the generosity of local Methodists, who helped the family in many ways. They became members of Rain Memorial Methodist Church when it opened its doors in 1875. Susie May grew up with the Methodist spirit of mission, and so became a teacher and worker at the Mary Werline Mission, whose undertaking it was to minister to the social and religious needs of the overcrowded and troubled area of New Orleans known as the Irish Channel. Susie May met Reverend Charles T. Munholland, who was conducting a revival at the mission. They were married shortly after on April 10, 1895. Reverend Munholland served in the Louisiana Conference from 1872 until his death in 1907. Mrs. Munholland once said, "The 12 years as the wife of a tireless Methodist circuit preacher were the happiest years of my life." After Reverend Munholland's death, Mrs. Munholland earned her living as a bookkeeper. In 1923, she built a house in Metairie for herself and her invalid sister, Ori. The house still stands today, just a few blocks down Elmire Avenue from the church Mrs. Munholland would help to found. That little congregation of Metairie Methodist Church worshipped at Metairie High School and was steadily growing in membership. On May 27, 1937, the lot at the corner of Metairie Road and Elmire Avenue was purchased for $1,500. Mrs. Munholland donated $500 for the down payment of the property, becoming the church's first donor. In November 1937, Reverend Carl Took was appointed the church's first full-time pastor. Reverend Took established a drive to raise the money to pay off the $1,000 debt on the property. This was quickly accomplished on February 9, 1938, and another drive was started for the construction of a church school building on the newly acquired property. In July of this year, Mrs. Munholland showed her generosity once again by donating her house at 232 Elmire for use as the parsonage. She would continue to live there, however, and the rear portion of the house was made into a separate apartment for her.
Reverend Took, when he first became pastor here, was single, and he lived with Miss Munholland. And then he married this lovely woman from St. Mark's.
To show their gratitude for Mrs. Munholland's generosity, the congregation decided to rename the church after her. She humbly declined, but instead asked that the church be named for her late husband. Therefore, Metairie Methodist Church became Munholland Memorial Methodist Church. Construction of the first building on the property began on September 1st, 1938. Reverend Took acted as contractor, foreman, carpenter, and laborer to construct the small two-story building. The bricks were donated, coming from the base of an abandoned shipyard in Slidell. Reverend Took and some of the young men of the church used a borrowed dump truck to relocate the bricks to the site. The second anniversary of the church was celebrated in an unfinished building. There was no roof, and the rain held off just long enough for the benediction to be pronounced. This first building still stands today. Half of the first floor is part of the present vestibule, and the second floor houses air conditioning equipment. The remainder of the building houses the chancel area of the sanctuary, which was added on later. In 1939, a small wood frame building was constructed next to the original building on Elmire for use as Sunday school classrooms. This same year, plans were begun to build a sanctuary. Much of the work was contracted for the construction of the sanctuary, but Reverend Took, along with some of the men from the church, again helped with the construction.
I would remember seeing Reverend Carl Took in work clothing with one of these carpenter's belts on around his waist with the hammer, the nails, and the saw up on the roof of the sanctuary.
And he helped build the church.
And so, I mean, when one would say he helped build the church, I saw him build it.
He did it physically.
I saw him build it.
The first time my dad saw him, Carl Took was laying brick. And that appealed to my dad a lot. He thought, well, this isn't the usual preacher, because they don't usually do things like that. And so he decided that we ought to join his church because I had a man like Carl Took as the minister. So we did, and he and Carl Took became very close friends, and he was a frequent visitor in our home. And he was a very nice, charming man.
Besides his calm demeanor, Reverend Took was also a humble man.
You have cornerstones, and he didn't want a stone. But after he left, we marked the front of the church, behind all that shrubbery, there's a cornerstone that says Carl Took, 1940. And so it was actually put there after he was gone.
The first service was held in the sanctuary on January 5, 1941. The total cost of the construction of the building before furnishings was $11,000. Of this, Mrs. Munholland had contributed $10,000 towards the project. With the recent passing of her brother, she saw his inheritance as a sacred trust given to her by God and would not keep any of this money for herself. This was the type of person Mrs. Munholland was. She did not only donate her money, but also her time, as she was also the church's treasurer and served on the board of trustees.
Oh, she was a delightful lady, delightful, very gentle, and genteel, you know. And she was, to me, a real Southern lady.
She was loved and respected by the members of the church, and along with Reverend Took, they were the embodiment of what the church would become, a congregation of generous and loving people. Later that year, on December 7th, the country was struck with unimaginable horror at Pearl Harbor.
We heard about Pearl Harbor from the pastor, Carl Took.
Did he announce that during the sermon, or?
No, when we shook hands with him at the door and came in, he said, "Isn't it terrible what happened at Pearl Harbor?" I said, "What happened?" Because we'd been out sightseeing that afternoon. We had no idea what was going on. So we always remember what happened the first day we set foot inside Munholland.
And because of this, many of Munholland's men and women were called into active duty. Many members left, some would not come back.
Rapid growth in the membership brought with it the need to expand and equip the facilities. Unusual measures such as advertisements on the worship bulletins were used to raise much needed money. During this time, Mrs. Munholland was a generous and sometimes anonymous contributor.
When we came, the sanctuary was much smaller now, and it had raw concrete floor. We had a few old opera seats that thrown out of some theater somewhere, and plywood furniture for the pulpit.
But it took less than 2 years for the money to be raised for proper furniture. The first pipe organ, bought used for $700, was played for the first time on Palm Sunday in April 1942.
One of our first organs, it had 75 years of experience at Rain.
Is that right? We got handed down from Rain.
Well, the first 2 organs we had were hand-me-downs.
The pews were ordered in August of that year and were assembled and installed for use on Sunday, February 14, 1943, giving the sanctuary a seating capacity of 300.
And some of the pews that we raised money for, we're still sitting on. We added more pews.
The oak pulpit and lectern were purchased by the Women's Society of Christian Service. By 1943, Munholland was no longer considered a mission church, having accepted its full share of General Conference benevolence.
We had a lot of fun. The minister had my husband bring his truck, and they'd get a gang of children and go out to the lakefront and have a watermelon party. And then they'd go under the bridge and light a fire and put weenies on a stick and have a weenie roast and a marshmallow toast. We really had some good times.
But we did have Sunday night services, by the way.
That's right. Everybody did.
And that's something I wish we had now, but a lot of people would come Sunday morning and Sunday night, is what I would do, because we had the Methodist youth, and then we would leave from that, we'd go to the church, then we'd go get a soda or something afterwards, or ice cream, and it was kind of a social thing. But you got to see a lot of your friends, and this is what was so important at the time. So
I can remember at one point in time, we went on a truck ride, or hay ride, or whatever. We had an old beat-up truck out there, and Reverend Took drove the truck and went along like as a chaperone its function. And I remember old Johnny Priest was quite a prankster, and he got hold of a bottle of Jack Daniels, and he emptied it out, of course, and he filled it with iced tea. And we back here on this truck ride, man, having a ball, and everybody passed that bottle of Jack Daniel bottle of iced tea around. And Reverend Took saw that, man, he got out, he went into orbit. He wasn't expecting that.
That's when they had all the boy-girl stuff, and this is where everybody met everybody.
Oh, and Sunday nights they had it with league.
It sounds like a pretty active church.
Yeah.
Well, there really wasn't too much to do. If you didn't catch the streetcar and go to town, you just, there wasn't much to do. That was it.
So, and we invited anybody that wanted to come. We wanted numbers.
1945, I was home on leave from the Navy, getting ready to go to the Pacific Ocean, and I came to church with them. At my mother's insistence. And after church, we were standing around talking to folks outside, and I heard a couple of people talking, and they said, one of them said, Carl Took and Paul Treen must be crazy. They want to spend, I think it's $35,000 they're planning to spend on building an addition to this church. And he said, that's an awful lot of money, and we don't have that much money. And we don't have that many people. How are we going to fill this church up? So I was very curious about this because my dad was involved in it, and I went home and I said, Dad, people think you're crazy because you want to build an addition to the church and don't have the money and don't have the people. He said, well, this is a growing area out here. It's going to grow some more. And in time, it's going to look like a bargain. But they both had the feeling that the church could do a great deal of good in influencing young people in the right kind of behavior. And I think he's right.
The Great War was over, and the population explosion forced people out of the cities and into the suburbs. The population of Metairie soared, and so did the membership of Munholland Memorial Methodist Church.
when my husband returned from the war, we lived uptown for a short while, and then we bought our first home out here in Metairie, and here was Munholland. And the minister was Dana Dawson and his wife Betty, and they had a little tiny girl.
Reverend Dana Dawson was appointed as Munholland's minister in 1946.
I think we all had a great feeling of affinity with Dana Dawson. He was young, his wife was young, and this was a growing time after the war, and people were moving back home, or new people were moving in here. And he had a great attraction to young people.
He was more of a public relations man. He knew how to get out and get the people in.
And one Sunday, Dana, Jed Arthur, and Herb Hotmeyer came to the house, sat on the front porch and talked to us. And just out of the blue, Dana said, "Well, Joe, when would you like to join the church?" And he said, "Just any time." "Well, how about next Sunday?" "That'll be fine."
He was a good speaker, too. Yeah, he was, but he had more. I think this is when Munholland turned the corner into becoming a church, a real church. Big church.
The great rise in membership necessitated more facilities. A fundraising campaign was organized to construct the grand community center Carl Took and Paul Treen had envisioned a few years earlier. Pamphlets and letters stating the gross lack of facilities were passed out to church members to raise funds for a new building. Members rose to the occasion, but since not enough money was raised, a less extravagant education building was constructed onto the original building on the site of that little wood frame building. It was built between 1949 and 1950 at a cost of $75,000. The blessing of a new building was soon followed by a great loss to the church. Susie May Munholland, who fought for a church to be established in Metairie and personally saw to it that the finances were there to make it happen, passed away on December 23, 1950, at the age of 83. Little Mother, as she was known by her intimate friends, had already done so much for this growing church, and even in death saw to it that her beloved church would grow by leaving all of her cash and bonds to the church, valued at $1,456.83. Services were held in the sanctuary the next day, Christmas Eve, before she was laid to rest next to her sister Ori at Metairie Cemetery in a simple and dignified plot. During Reverend Dawson's tenure, the church grew from around 250 members to being the largest church in the New Orleans district. Further expansions resulted, including additions to the sanctuary in 1952. A balcony was added, and the chancel was rebuilt into the original two-story building. More pews were added to the sanctuary, as well as a pastor's study, more classrooms, and an air conditioning and heating system. Reverend D.W. Poole was appointed to Munholland in February 1955, and the expansion of the church's membership and facilities continued. By the end of his tenure in May 1957, membership stood at 1,587. A new educational building was contracted by early 1957 and completed under the tenure of Reverend E.W. Harris in October 6 that same year. This new building greatly expanded the area that the church had for its many activities. It contained several classrooms, the courtyard, the fellowship hall, and the kitchen. The fellowship hall and the kitchen opened up many social opportunities, including the couples club.
I think there were 12 couples that organized it, and at one time we had attendance of like 100. And it was not just to Methodists, it was open to community.
My wife, with some of the ladies in the church here, got together, and my wife suggested that we start a couples club here. And we did. And I use the word we because the whole idea of couple was husband and wife. And the only rule that we had was that if you're not married, you're not a couple. And it became a sore subject on occasions for people that wanted to become members, but we had to tell them point blank, no, you have to get married, be a couple. And our couples club was based on a prayer, a little social hour, sitting at a table and having a dinner, a host for each table, being a couple, and the host would introduce any guests that were there, and then we'd have our speaker.
We had some noted speakers, but because of my age, I don't remember all of them. John Chase was one.
I remember when Dr. Alton Oxner was one.
Skiro, when he was mayor, was that? Nash Roberts was at his peak, so we really had a group of wonderful people.
And we had a square dance club. It was also open to the community, and we had just built the new community hall, and it was a good place for dancing.
But you didn't have too many Baptists in that organization.
One of the fundraisers of the Women's Society was to cook for a couples club.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that really involved a lot of cooking for over 100 people, huh, Lily?
If you joined the Women's Society, you were involved in cooking. I have many friends who said they would join, but they didn't want to be cooking all the time.
We had a ball team.
Did we? That's the first I've heard of that.
Is that right?
No kidding. With softball or basketball?
Walt Blassie was our pitcher.
No
kidding. He was a professor at Tulane. You know, Walt and Ruth. And Bob Middlestead was a first baseman. That's when television wasn't on, I believe. When we went out and ate snowballs after the game.
Mrs. Munholland's house at 232 Elmere, which was the church's parsonage for 22 years, was sold in 1960. Several other parsonages were bought and sold over the years, but the purchase of 1203 Metairie Road in 1961 was particularly significant, and later allowed space for the final building addition to be constructed. After being used as a parsonage for some time, it was torn down to make way for a much-needed parking lot. Over the years, membership levels went up and down. Some of this downward momentum was due to several purgings of the membership rolls, as carried out by the Order of the Charge Conference. The buildings remained mostly unchanged for the next few decades, undergoing only cosmetic and maintenance refurbishments until the turn of the century. Some highlights of these following years include a used pipe organ being purchased for the church's 25th anniversary in 1961.
We had an old tracker organ, and it used to be down in there in that hole, and Joe sang solos. He said it bothered him because when Willa Bill pulled the stops out, he'd hear them all. Of course, you couldn't hear them out here, but he could hear them standing right there. So I said, well, I guess I better get busy and see if we can get a new organ.
For the 30th anniversary, portraits of Reverend and Mrs. Munholland were hung in the sanctuary to commemorate their profound contributions to New Orleans Methodism and Munholland Memorial Methodist Church. December 10, 1967 saw the dedication of the stained glass circles in the Gothic windows of the sanctuary. The following year, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren to become the United Methodist Church. Therefore, Munholland Memorial Methodist Church was renamed Munholland United Methodist Church a couple of years later in 1970.
In 1977, the church acquired its first brand new organ, which was designed especially for Munholland Sanctuary. It is still in use today. In December of that year, a young lady named Mattie Crockett came to work as the church's housekeeper and is still an important member of the Munholland family.
Though many pastors and associate pastors made their individual marks on Munholland over the following decades, the next major change to the church did not come until 2001, during Reverend Nick Evans' tenure, when a new 3-story office and education building was constructed on Metairie Road behind the original building. Additionally, extensive renovations took place throughout the church buildings.
Basically, we accomplished what they wanted to do. They wanted to get rid of all the old church offices and make that into reception room, and they wanted to redo the choir room, and they wanted an office for the choir director, so we did that.
Munholland's history is one of giving and growing. As more room was needed, members such as Mrs. Munholland stepped up to allow the church to expand. The generosity and compassion of the members of Munholland can still be seen today as the New Orleans area cleans up from Hurricane Katrina. Current pastor of Munholland, Reverend Gene Fennell, talks about Munholland during this difficult time.
Before Katrina and Rita, Munholland was a church that had 4 weekly worship services, 1 on Saturday afternoon and 3 on Sunday morning. We also have a Wednesday evening communion service, and we still are doing that, but after Katrina we reduced the number of worship services from 4 to 2 on Sunday morning, primarily because of loss of attendees in worship, and we've seen our attendance drop probably 30 to 35%. But fortunately, in terms of our program activity, we've been able to maintain a very active program as far as what we're offering our children, our Sunday school program, our youth program, our music program, our special study programs, including Disciple Bible Study. Those kinds of activities we've been able to maintain. And we were a very active church in that regard before the storms, and have been able to continue on that basis after the storms. One new dimension to the life of the church that we've taken on since the storms has been the hosting of groups who have come here to work in our community. And I don't have the exact number, but I know that we've had well over 1,000 people stay at the church.
I'm with a group here from Legion. Some have been here twice. We have one lady that has been here 3 times. The second trip that was made down here by Legion, it was gutting houses. And of course the third trip, that's what we've been doing. We've been gutting the house. But it was just overwhelming. The feeling that we got just looking around us and knowing that these people, their whole lives have been changed, and that mementos that have been in that house for years and years was just gone. Memories just washed away.
Last year when we came, and as our church bus just drove down the streets and we were getting close to our destination, the home, there were several people out in the yards, and they would either clap, and one young guy just actually saluted us, and that just really brought tears to my eyes, because they were so appreciative of us coming and spending our time to help them.
It's not how we're touching their lives, it's how they're touching our lives. Just like today, when we got to the job site, I was so overwhelmed with what I saw that I'm telling you, I almost broke down and cried.
It's been an exciting experience for us, because these groups that have come down here have brought life and energy and vitality, and that certainly has had an impact on our congregation, and we are tremendously appreciative to all of those folks that have come and served and continue to come back again.
It's been fantastic for a church to open their doors to folks from out of town. It's been awesome. When we got here last night, it was about 5:15. By 5:30, 20 minutes to 6, we were eating supper with part of the congregation downstairs. And I mean, it's just awesome that the church opens its doors to outsiders to come in to help the community.
everyone's nice. They share their Sunday school rooms, their spaces, their bathrooms, and just, you know, all their concern is how they can make it more convenient for us. And I don't know that, I know a lot of churches that wouldn't do that, but they have just opened up their arms, and we feel very welcome when we come here.
Reverend Fennell's message on the first Easter since Hurricane Katrina was one of hope for the future of our city and church.
Today we celebrate Easter with its proclamation that abrupt endings lead to new beginnings. When people come to our community, like they've been doing every week for months, and say, we care, and we're here to help you put things back together, the risen, living Christ is at work. When church members surround one another in love, the risen, living Christ is at work.
I think, you know, we've all been through the same experience. Now, we've experienced that in different ways. Not all of us lost our homes and our possessions, although some of us did. We've all been impacted by the changes in our community. So while our experiences have differed, we've all been influenced by the event itself. And I think that it's had the effect of pulling us together.
Another way Munholland reached out to the community was by working with hurricane-damaged Faith Baptist Church in New Orleans. Munholland hosted a concert that they had put together for their 5th anniversary, which was to be performed right after Hurricane Katrina. On September 10th, 2006, the choirs from both churches came together and performed a concert.
It's, I think, a very nice one to honor Faith Baptist Church, and even more than that, to honor this connection that we have, this Christian brotherhood and sisterhood, and this connection between humankind. And so,
in 2006, Munholland celebrated its 70th anniversary with special worship services and a celebratory luncheon.
This day has been the effort of the Susie May Munholland Scholarship Committee. And because of Susie May Munholland and the Scholarship Fund, we are able to grant scholarships to people who have been part of the Munholland congregation and have gone on to an education in seminary. And we've got 4 people here this morning who have been recipients of that scholarship fund.
On this day of reflection, we thank you for the gift that Susie May Munholland offered us many years ago. We thank you for June, Faye, Gloria, Bill, and the countless others that paved the way and helped shape Munholland into a congregation that continues to invite people into Christian discipleship.
You start with the cornerstone, which sets the direction of the entire structure. And when the cornerstone is Christ Jesus, everything else will be right.
To commemorate the physical and spiritual building of the church, the scripture adopted for the celebration was, "Christ is our cornerstone. God is building a home, fitting us brick by brick." This reminds us that though buildings are an important part of any church, it is the people and their faith in God that make a church what it is.
I want us to be a church that is committed to reaching out to people in our area and to extending them the hand of Christian fellowship and inviting them into this church, and to enabling them to have a church home and to experience the love of a church family that cares tremendously about one another. And that's the joy of this congregation, and that's a joy that I experience as being the pastor here.
Dr. Duke Eversmeyer leaves us with his hopes for Munholland's 75th anniversary and beyond.
This celebration is looking at the past glories of our church, but I think over the next 5 years we're going to have to get over this Katrina malaise and build our church back. I mean, right now we're a little more than hostile for people coming into New Orleans to tear down and build up old houses. So we need to put ourselves back where we were, and I think we will. I mean, we've got the nucleus of our church, and the enthusiasm's still there, and the spirit's still there. So maybe we can celebrate something different 5 years from now.
The stress of time and use can be seen on the earlier buildings of Munholland, but repairs are underway to preserve the church that was so dear to Mrs. Munholland's heart. When she passed away in 1950, she could have rested much more elaborately, as seen by the graves surrounding her, but she chose to give her money to the church she had so much faith in. As this once little church on Metairie Road helps its community rebuild after Hurricane Katrina, one only has to visit Susie May Munholland's grave just a few miles away in Metairie Cemetery to see that she would have been proud of the work being done, for her epitaph reads, "It is more blessed to give than to receive."
This film was brought to you by the Susie May Munholland Scholarship Committee. The Susie May Munholland Scholarship Endowment Fund was initiated in 1986 by the Munholland Jubilee Committee to provide financial help for members of Munholland United Methodist Church engaged in graduate work in Christian ministry. The scholarship is open to qualified individuals accepted for advanced study in Christian education, sacred music, or Christian ministry. The fund is financed through fundraisers and support from church members. Please contact the church office to learn more about the fund or to make a donation.